The skies over Pearl Harbor had been the ultimate declaration of war. Japan struck with surgical, arrogant precision, believing they had delivered a crippling blow to the sleeping giant, sinking the American battle line, slaughtering thousands of sailors. The initial intelligence reports to Tokyo pulsed with triumph. The United States, it was presumed, was wounded, demoralized, and finished. But history rarely grants wishes to the aggressor. As the smoke cleared and the initial euphoria faded, the Imperial spies began to file their secondary, chilling reports. America had not crumpled. America had not sued for peace. Instead, the vast industrial heartland of the Republic roared to life. For every warship sunk in the attack, the shipyards of America churned out 2, then 3, then 4 newer, faster, deadlier hulls. In the hushed planning rooms of Tokyo, the initial pride evaporated. The admirals went silent, staring at statistics that defied military logic. This was not merely war. This was industrial revolution weaponized. They grasped the brutal truth. Japan had not secured a victory. They had only signed the death warrant of their empire. It was, arguably, the most catastrophic miscalculation in the history of modern warfare. How does a nation respond to an enemy that multiplies its power exponentially? Why did the Imperial High Command refuse to acknowledge the impossible odds mounting against them? The deepest secret, the most shocking truth of all, was this. Japanese military leadership had already run the grim calculation. They knew the tsunami of American steel was coming. They knew surrender meant national humiliation. And so, with a cold, calculated desperation that defies reason, they decided to fight anyway, to fight a war they knew they could not win. December 7th, 1941, the day Japan believed it had achieved the final victory. Instead, they had simply ensured the scale of their own coming defeat. The victory that wasn't. Ticker tape and triumph coated the streets of Tokyo. The headlines screamed a decisive, paralyzing blow. For the Japanese High Command, the map was redrawn. The American giant had stumbled, perhaps irrevocably fallen. They expected capitulation, or at least years of painful negotiation. But across the Pacific, beneath the pall of shock, a cold, hard defiance took root. America did not break. America did not kneel. President Roosevelt's voice sliced through the despair, delivering a message of absolute, uncompromising resolve. This was not the speech of a nation preparing to surrender. It was the roar of an enraged empire. "We shall win absolute victory," he promised. The Axis powers scoffed, dismissing the declaration as desperate bravado. They believed they had bought years of critical breathing room. They were catastrophically wrong. While celebration consumed the imperial capital, a new, relentless clock began ticking across the United States. Sleep ceased to be a priority. Darkness became an inconvenience. The nation transformed into a massive, churning forge. Thousands of men and women flooded the yards, answering a silent, desperate call that echoed across state lines. From the docks of California, where destroyers were welded into existence under blazing floodlights, to the deep harbors of New York, where the massive keels of new battleships were laid. The pace was terrifying. The assembly lines never stopped moving. Day shift bled seamlessly into the night shift. Weekend vanished from the calendar. The goal was singular: replace the lost and build the impossible fleet. The output was astonishing. Every 24 hours, the Atlantic and the Pacific swallowed fresh steel. One massive hull slid down the waves and kissed the water. Then another. Then another. They came in waves, not of water, but of steel. 10 hulls, 20 keels laid down, then 40. Every 7 days brought a new fleet to the waves. The machines did not sleep. They were the tireless, churning heart of the arsenal of democracy. Across the American landscape, the call had gone out, and the nation answered with a terrifying unity. The workers never rested. Factory floors became the new front lines. Women left their homes to weld plating. Teenagers traded school books for shift work. Retired men returned to their trades, driven by a singular, fierce understanding. To win this global war, the free world needed ships. And fast. Thousands of miles away, the enemy watched. Deep within the shadow network of the Imperial Japanese Navy, spies filed their reports, messages smuggled out of the humming, overwhelming heartland of America. The numbers that began to arrive in Tokyo were not merely statistics. They were an omen of ruin. They were impossible to believe. Japanese intelligence officers first read the cables with a disbelief that bordered on fury. They dismissed the figures as errors, as confusion, perhaps even as enemy disinformation. Surely, their agents were mistaken. Surely, the sheer volume was exaggerated. They ordered a double-check. The subsequent reports only magnified the terror. The industrial output was not slowing. It was accelerating at an astronomical rate. One agent, risking everything, reported 20 brand-new destroyers commissioned and ready for action in a single 30-day period. Another confirmed 30 assorted vessels added to the fleet in the very same window. The high admiralty of the Imperial fleet pored over these documents, the chilling reality sinking in. The Americans were not fighting a war of attrition. They were waging a war of overwhelming, limitless manufacture. The figures mocked every projection, shattered every strategic plan. They were staring into the terrifying, relentless might of an awakened giant. The calculations lay bare on the polished mahogany table, a stark ledger written in cold ink. Silence descended in the Tokyo war room, thick and suffocating. The veneer of victory, carefully maintained since Pearl Harbor, shattered. The room, heavy with humidity, offered no comfort. A senior naval minister dabbed frantically at the sweat beading on his upper lip, while a general staff officer pushed back on the table, unable to remain seated under the crushing weight of the intelligence. This was the inner sanctum, where the fate of the empire was measured. When the chief of staff finally broke the tension, his voice was a rasp choked with dread. He laid out the damning results of the latest espionage, the horrific, staggering rate of American shipbuilding. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was the sound of vast, catastrophic reckoning. They had focused on the initial strike, the swift conquest. They had forgotten the sheer, boundless industrial power they had antagonized. They had succeeded only in waking a sleeping giant. And now, the giant was stirring. Frantically, desperately, the highest command of the Imperial military scrambled to verify the figures. They totaled their oil reserves, their aircraft carriers, their remaining cruisers. They counted the weapons consumed and the men lost. But the brutal arithmetic was immutable. The American production line was moving at a pace Japan could never match. For every Imperial vessel sunk by a U.S. submarine, the yards of Long Beach and Newport News launched 3 more. For every cannon shell fired by the Japanese Army, the factories in Detroit stamped out 5 replacements. A senior admiral, his face carved stone, reached out to steady the stack of intelligence reports. His hand trembled uncontrollably. Leaning toward the officer beside him, he whispered the unthinkable, the ultimate fear that permeated the air. This is suicide. The whispered consensus in Tokyo was that such a task was impossible. But the cold, terrible truth of the incoming data reports proved them catastrophically wrong. It wasn't merely possible. It was a relentless, crushing reality. The American industrial machine, jolted awake by the shock of December 7th, was not just responding. It was rising. Across the Pacific, assembly lines roared, drowning out the initial celebrations of Pearl Harbor. Japanese commanders might have won the first, spectacular skirmish, but they were now faced with a grim calculus. Victory in battle meant nothing against the relentless, geometric progression of American might. Japan had snatched a glorious tactical victory. America was building an empire of steel. Raw materials were finite. Industrial capacity was limited. Japan could not sustain the pace. As the devastating figures confirming the shipbuilding rates arrived, a tsunami of hulls rising from the slipways, a deathly silence fell over the Imperial conference room. It was a silence broken only by the quiet, haunted voice of the old admiral who dared speak the unthinkable. We have made a terrible mistake. 3 words. The instant everything changed. That voice belonged to Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, perhaps the only man in the Imperial Command structure who truly grasped the scale of the impending disaster. Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, was also the Empire's most articulate Cassandra. He had studied in America. He had lived among its people. He understood the nation's latent, terrifying power, its spirit, its resilience, and above all, the sheer, unimaginable output of its sprawling factories. After absorbing the final, crushing report on Allied production, a forecast so bleak it defied comprehension, Admiral Isaaruki Yamamoto uttered the prophetic words that would forever define the fatal miscalculation of the Empire. The crushing failure of Operation Luttich reverberated through the hastily assembled headquarters. The audacious counterattack, meant to cut to the Allied line and seize the crucial junction at Avranches, had only succeeded in drawing the full, overwhelming fury of American retaliation. It was in this desperate, smoke-choked moment that the ghosts of past miscalculations materialized. They echoed the chilling realization that had settled over the Imperial Japanese Navy Command years earlier. All we have done is awaken a sleeping giant. They had poked the bear. They believed their initial aggression at Mortain would splinter the green American formations. Instead, the response was measured, massive, and utterly unforgiving. Every passing hour saw the enemy grow stronger, their logistical pipelines flooding the battlefield with men, steel, and fuel in amounts the Wehrmacht simply could not match. The fear was visceral, sinking deep into the ornate map rooms. A paralyzing realization took hold. This was not a battle that could be won by superior tactics or individual heroism. It was a war of material consequence, and Germany had already lost a mathematical equation. Panic spiraled into open conflict among the officers. Some demanded immediate, localized withdrawals to stem the hemorrhage. Others, gripped by the dogma of total war, screamed for relentless counterthrusts, suicidal assaults aimed at ghosts. The argument raged, fueled by exhaustion and the stench of burnt diesel. They were trapped. They had initiated the attack, believing the enemy would break. Now, they understood that the enemy wouldn't quit. They had unleashed an industrial storm they could neither control nor withstand. While the roar of American factories choked the skies, burying the Pacific under an avalanche of steel, a poisonous division festered within the Imperial Japanese High Command. One faction, desperate, screamed for reckless expansion, a final, devastating thrust intended to shock the enemy into negotiation. The pragmatists recoiled. More attacks? That wasn't strategy, it was suicide. To lash out now was only to prove the enemy's resilience, fueling an industrial machine already operating at terminal velocity. The war rooms in Tokyo devolved into volatile cauldrons of accusation. Fingers jabbed across polished maps, rang forgotten in the heat of existential terror, because the brutal, unvarnished truth was always the same. Japan had firepower. Japan had the Bushido spirit. Japan had the finest soldiers the emperor could muster. But Japan did not have Pittsburgh. It did not have the oil fields of Texas. It did not have the inexhaustible furnace of American industry. They were fighting a war of arithmetic against an adversary defined by infinity. Every time a Japanese carrier sank, America built 3 replacements. Every time a division was annihilated, 3 new ones landed. They could not keep pace. No strategic genius could overcome the laws of material physics. Finally, in a hushed, horrified moment, a junior officer dared voice the unspoken terror haunting the generals. How do you fight an enemy who is literally building the next ship faster than you can sink the last one? This was the impossible choice. The terrible calculus that had to be performed in secret. The leadership of Japan faced only 2 options, both soaked in humiliation and blood. Surrender immediately, conceding total, humiliating defeat now, or fight on, guaranteeing an even more catastrophic loss later. Both paths led to ruin. Both options. Surrender was not an option. It was a ghost in the command rooms, whispering the ultimate violation of honor. Defeat was inevitable pain. The Imperial High Command, bound by a code more sacred than life itself, refused to accept either calculation. They chose the inferno. They declared war not against American soldiers, but against arithmetic itself. They knew the scales were tilted, that American factories were churning out a war machine built of limitless steel and fury, yet they clung to the myth of righteous conflict. Victory was a ghost, but the fight was everything. This catastrophic resolve was a final signature on the Empire's death warrant. The price would be paid in the currency of 1,000 shattered lives, the immolation of great cities, and the total, agonizing collapse of the nation. But in that moment of ultimate decision, the general saw only the blinding, self-imposed light of duty. They could not conceive a world where American industrial might trump the ancient spirit of their warriors. They would not stop. This ferocious, tragic obstinacy solidified the destiny of the Pacific, a prolonged campaign of grinding attrition, where ships were built only to be sunk, battles fought only to be lost, and death multiplied exponentially. They had seen the truth laid bare, yet they refused to change course, heading toward a final reckoning they could not, ultimately, escape. The war machine finally shuddered to a halt 3 years later. The empire of the rising sun, which had begun the conflict with such terrifying confidence, was utterly extinguished. The grand vision of Pacific dominion had dissolved into smoke and shadow. The tides had turned irrevocably. Where the Imperial Navy once ruled, American carrier fleets now presided over the oceans. Where the Zero once soared unchallenged, U.S. air power commanded the skies, blotting out the sun. Relentlessly, the American armies clawed back every inch of territory, transforming every island into a fortress of shattered concrete. The home islands themselves were shattered. Cities that stood for centuries were reduced to pulverized ash and skeletal remains. Millions of lives have been consumed in the furnace of that final, devastating defeat. The dream of a boundless Japanese empire was buried forever beneath the monumental wreckage. Looking back, historians pinpoint the moment of irreversible failure. Japan made one foundational, cataclysmic error. They attacked America without comprehending the true nature of American power. They saw a peaceful nation, not the industrial juggernaut lying dormant. They scorned the American factory floor, failing to calculate the speed and scale at which that colossal industrial engine could churn out ships, tanks, and aircraft. They misjudged the fierce, unyielding determination of a nation unified by attack. Their strategy hinged entirely on the belief that one devastating blow, a single tactical masterpiece, would force America to its knees. They were not merely wrong, they were catastrophically mistaken. Had the generals and admirals listened to the prescient warnings of Yamamoto in that critical military room, had they acknowledged the cold, hard truth about American production quotas, history might have written a different final chapter. They could have chosen negotiation. They could have limited the scale of the ultimate devastation wrought upon their country. But driven by rigid ideology, they refused to see the reality in front of them. The thunder that defined the American war machine was not the sound of courage. It was a collective, relentless roar of production. Power, historians would later realize, was not measured solely in the grim determination of the infantryman. Power was measured in tonnage, in assembly line speed, in the terrifying, inexhaustible output of a mobilized nation. While the enemy fought with fierce, finite resources, America fought with a tidal wave of steel. This industrial supremacy fundamentally shattered the strategic calculus of the Axis. In the vast, unforgiving expanse of the Pacific, the Japanese High Command watched in horror. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grave warnings about American naval power echoed unanswered as the U.S. fleet, battered but not broken at Pearl Harbor, didn't just rebuild, it multiplied. The Battle of Midway was not just a tactical defeat. It was an industrial verdict. America's capacity to absorb devastating losses and immediately produce more ships, more planes, and more fuel devastated the Japanese assessment of the war's trajectory. Their strategies, based on the assumption of a finite opponent, proved fatal. That relentless flow of material was a foundation upon which every hard-won yard was gained globally. Months later, in the summer heat of 1944, that same industrial might meant the difference between victory and catastrophe in France. When the Wehrmacht launched its desperate counterstroke, Operation Luttich, aimed at seizing the critical junction of Avranches, it was a firepower delivered by those distant American factories that stiffened the defenses around Mortain. Underestimating determination and the furnace of American industry cost the enemy everything. One decision, the total mobilization of the American industrial heartland, changed the course of history forever. The factories won the war before the final battle was even fought.